The former president and CEO of the New England Aquarium, Bud Riss, serves on the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, where he co-chairs the city's task force on climate change preparedness. He is also a member of Boston's Climate Action Plan Steering Committee and the Downtown Waterfront Municipal Harbor Plan Advisory Committee. He's a Boston Harbor Association trustee, and in 2014 won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Bud, I'd love to hear you from you.
While my slides are queuing up, one of them has a lot of megabytes in it, I'm going to issue a disclaimer. I do know many people in this room, and I think most of you know me as a fairly lively, even sometimes funny person. I have 3 pinched nerves in my back, and I timed the ibuprofen to hit at 2:45. So let's hope things pick up in the next few minutes. So I'm talking a little more softly than usual. Sorry. Unless you feel sorry for me, let me tell you this. I think the reason I have this pinched nerves is because I retired in June and I did too much sailing and cranking for the last 4 months. So by hook or by crook, I've ended up, I think, in a little bit of a summary position here, sort of thinking about this issue over the last several days, and I put together a set of slides that I think are going to actually come back to a lot of the points that have been raised and hopefully frame up the rest of the conversation for the afternoon. But what I'm going to focus on are to talk about some topics and issues where universities, the nonprofit NGO community, which I came from, and public agencies can work together to try to solve some of these big problems and tackle some of the challenges that we heard about earlier today. I've been working on this issue for a very long time. I was laughing to myself and looking at the charts. Tony said he goes back to 50 parts per million of change. I go back to 85. So that's a little bit further. And I think it's particularly appropriate to have this conversation here in academia, right in the heart of academia here in Boston. How can universities, the nonprofit sector, and government agencies work together? A little bit of context, and a lot of this was talked about earlier today. In my lifetime, at least, and my 75 parts per million working on this issue, projections have now become reality. And I think you've all heard that here today. And we've shifted to adaptation. But we have to be very, very careful we don't shift the balance too far. Because if we don't stick with the mitigation side, we're going to have a really, really big problem going forward. So we have to always keep that in balance. I think some other things to remember, we frame a lot of this conversation around the year 2100, just because that's about as far ahead as anybody can think and begin to hypothesize, and also because it's a nice round number. But that's not so far away anymore. My dad died 2 years ago at 98. So that's what, somebody do the math, 86 years from now, 2100. That's in the lifetime of some people born fairly recently. And then back to this question of collaboration, and we've seen a lot of it here today. I think there are a lot of useful precedents already in Boston for particularly the academic and NGO community working together and working with city agencies to begin to frame up and tackle this problem. I'll show you one more version of the TBHA maps in my presentation. That was actually a collaboration between TBHA and hydrologists at UMass Boston and engineers from UNH, et cetera. A great model of collaboration. There's a huge academic and NGO resource here in Boston. I had this fantasy a few weeks ago that I was going to sit down on my computer and try to Google how many departments of atmospheric sciences, how many departments of engineering, how many departments of hydrology, how many business schools, how many architecture schools. Scores, hundreds, maybe. There's a huge talent in here in Boston, so we're very lucky. We've got to figure out how to put that resource into work. So I'm going to just focus quickly on 6 different areas. And you've heard a lot of this, I think, today, people asking for this kind of work to be done. Number one, how do we translate the science into planning guidance that we can actually use to make the decisions we have to make? How can we better communicate risk and the vulnerabilities we face to policymakers, the general public, the development community, et cetera? How can we synthesize the known and projected risks to establish planning and implementation priorities? What do we know and how can we develop site-specific solutions? And perhaps with the Venice example, how can we begin to look on a grander scale at more comprehensive solutions? And finally, just following off from the conversation we just had, how can we make Boston a regional leader in resilience financing, in financing the solutions to this problem? So translating the science into planning, there is a wealth of scientific information, and you're familiar with a lot of this. You've heard it over the last day and a half. The IPCC puts out their major report every 7 years with about 2,500 to 3,000 scientists working on it. There's a national assessment that's done periodically that Tony talked about. There are regional assessments that are done periodically. UCS did a number of important pieces of work here in New England that were ultimately used by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for its climate planning. My guess is there are hundreds to 1,000 papers that come out every year on this topic or topics relevant to it. So as we said in the last session, there is no shortage of information and data. Planners, regulators, and developers need clarity and predictability to make the decisions they have to make. And that planning guidance must make sense. It must correlate with the capital life of the buildings or the infrastructure or the things that they are investing in. So if they're designing a building that's going to last for 30 years, they need information that's going to guide them through that period and build the building accordingly. If it's going to be 100 years, it's a different story. And then there's a key question. You saw lots of trajectories and lots of graph lines in here about where we're headed. We need to know, here go my nerves, sorry. We need to know how we're doing on those trajectories every 5, every 10 years in order to help us determine what we really have to do in the years ahead. So there has to be a constant feedback loop, checking back on where we are and which of those scenarios are beginning to happen and give us enough time to prepare in advance. So I think it's really important that some kind of mechanism be created, and this is something here where the scientific community could really help in Boston, some sort of maybe science advisory group to the public agencies and others that can on a regular basis kind of update what we know. You've seen these maps, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to come back to them in the slide after that. On the left is the now famous preliminary 100-year flood FEMA map for Boston, which has now been challenged by the city. It shows the 100-year flood boundary, and it will probably get resolved, I hope, sometime in the next year, maybe 18 months. And so we will have a new 100-year flood map from Boston, which will be very, very useful. As Brian said earlier, about 10,000 more buildings or homes are going to be in the flood zone than there were in the past. That will be very controversial, to say the least. We've had these wonderful maps from the Boston Harbor Associates showing three different scenarios, 2.5, 5, and I think 7.5 feet of sea level rise from mean high water. And that's important to understand that. They call it the bathtub model because basically they went around the city, looked at the average of mean high water. There's actually 2 high tides every day, and one is higher than the other one. So it's the average of the highest ones. And then they just added several feet of water on top of that to show what it would look like if there was that amount of flooding caused by something. But it's really important to understand that those are illustrations. They are not predictions of the future. They're big what if. What if either the seas rose 2.5 feet or the seas rose 1.5 feet and we had a foot of storm surge together with that, what would that do to the city? So it's really important. So here I am in the aquarium, running it for the last 9 years. I keep seeing these maps over and over again. And which facility is always right in the middle of all this, right? Now, fortunately, we're pretty good at handling salt water. And we have a very different problem than everybody else in this room. What we worry about as a storm is how do we keep 50,000 fish alive, which is obviously a secondary concern to human beings. But if it's your business, it's pretty important. So we actually spent a fair amount of time beginning to look at different scenarios. And one of the other great luxuries I had at the aquarium for many years is showing my slides in the IMAX theater, which is 85 feet wide, which is bigger than this room. And you can put something in any size type you want and people can read it. So here you can't, and I apologize for that. But you see the aquarium pier, and there's an IMAX theater and then the main building. Next time you go to the aquarium, I hope you go to the aquarium, notice that you'll be walking uphill when you go in the front door. The front door of the main aquarium out on the end of the pier is actually 3 or 4 feet higher than the IMAX building that you pass on the way out there. And what's really interesting, and I'll come back to this later, you can think of a lot of ways to protect the main building of the aquarium in a major flood or against incremental sea level rise, but because it's higher than everything else around it, you'll be the last person standing. You'll be higher than everything else around you, everything else will be flooded. The IMAX theater will get wet way before the New England Aquarium. And I just show this, and you can see different numbers I plotted on there to try to kind of figure out what scenario to choose to plan for in the future. The real problem is the likely future is going to be some combination of these different levels. You know, there's the 100-year storm, and if it occurs at a certain high tide, and if the sea's risen 2.5 feet, certain thing is going to happen, which is going to be very different than any of the scenarios on this piece of paper. So speaking for the landowners in Boston, we need good help, clear guidance from the scientific, academic community and the NGO community and anybody else to really figure out some clear scenarios to plan on for the future. Because believe me, it's not that easy to figure it out. How can we better communicate the risks? This is something I spent a lot of time on over the years. We had a very good conversation about it last night and today. And I think until the last presentation where there was a kind of a positive uplift of hopeful things to do, I could tell in the room everybody's getting pretty depressed about this issue. And it's not a really good way to promote action by depressing people. So one of the big things we've got to figure out is how to inject some hope to the task of, taking on this big challenge of issues. It's complicated because there are inherent uncertainties regarding the sensitivity of the climate to the amount of emissions we put up there, and there are big uncertainties about how many emissions we're going to put up there. And that's why whenever you see these numbers, it's always a range 3 to 7 degrees, or sea level 1 to 4 feet, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't know exactly how much carbon we're going to put in the atmosphere, so it's really hard to work that out. But there's obviously a strong scientific consensus that this is a serious problem. And then you got these complicated issues about incremental sea level rise versus storm surge flooding. And how do you explain that to the public? And they require different ways of thinking about this problem and responding to it. My favorite one, which of these 3 things would persuade you to do something? It's a storm that's going to happen once every 100 years. There's a 1% chance of the storm happening in any given year. There's a 26% chance or a 1 in 4 chance of the storm happening within the next 30 years, the life of your mortgage. They all mean exactly the same thing. But if you go to the fine print on the FEMA website, you'll finally find that third one, which I think is the most compelling one. And something that worries me, and I remember way back, remember the big blizzard of 1978? I was working for the Massachusetts Coastal Zone Program at that time. I went to Revere during the day handing out money so people could rebuild, went back to the CZM office at night trying to work on policies that would prevent them from rebuilding the wrong way again. And but those memories fade, very quickly from each of those storms. We are blessed we had the near miss from Sandy. And New York is not going to forget very soon. But I worry that we will forget because we've had several near misses, as Brian had. We know they're near misses. Most people don't. So how are we going to kindle the flame under this issue to stimulate action? That, I think, is a huge challenge. And I would hope that there are resources within the universities here in Boston that could really help us figure out how to communicate these issues and all these complexities in a way that can motivate people at all different levels to take the kinds of actions that we need. Anybody know how I'm doing on time? I'm going pretty fast, so we can start the next one earlier. Synthesizing risk assessments. The good news in this city and in our state, and I hope most of you know all these in acronyms, there are many efforts underway to look at the vulnerabilities of their facilities, their buildings, or their property, or their infrastructure. We talked about FEMA. The city is now reviewing the FEMA maps. Mass DOT has a very big study underway by the same people who did the colorful maps for TBHA and others to look at the vulnerability of the Big Dig to these different flooding scenarios. When that is done, that is going to provide a wealth of really good data for scenario planning going forward. The Boston Sewer and Water Commission has done a series of assessments, as we heard earlier, as has the MWRA, as has the City of Cambridge, as our private utilities, as our universities, as our private property owners, et cetera. At some point, we've got to synthesize all that into a compelling picture that helps us establish what the real priorities are going forward so we can galvanize the resources around the right solutions and the right investment to tackle those. It's not as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of bureaucratic fences around all those different departments that need to be broken down, but there's I think a really important need to synthesize all that and pull it together in a compelling way. Maybe there's a role for universities and NGOs, or maybe that's a private contractor function. I'm not sure. Excuse me. We've had a real wealth of activity in the last 6 or 8 months on various charrettes and ideas coming and contests around design solutions for buildings or for property or infrastructure here in Boston. And that's been absolutely fantastic. I think this is a really good opportunity for all of the design schools and maybe the business schools and the urban planning schools in the Boston area to work on either individually or together with the city. There's going to be a huge wealth of case studies, and I think everyone could really benefit from the learning and the experience of the schools here in Boston. We could be setting up internships in the public and private sector. Facility planners, I know through Dennis's work here, the facility planners at the universities are spending a lot of time on this, at least some of them are, and they're beginning to meet on a regular basis. How are they making BU resilient to the flooding that might come from the back bay or through the back door of the Fort Point Channel? And what's Harvard doing? What's MIT doing along the Charles Basin and so on? So that's a big wealth of opportunity, I think, to work together there. The biggest challenge is really existing buildings. And I forget the number exactly, maybe Julie, you knows, but in some of these flood vulnerability scenarios, something like 2/3 of the affected buildings are double and triple deckers, usually with wood frames in some of the older neighborhoods in Boston. That's a really big challenge to figure out how we can help the owners and the tenants in those buildings make their buildings more resilient. A really big challenge. So here's the Venice Solution to Boston. I put it up, and it's one of my least favorite solutions because I'm a sailor, and I go through that one lock. I go through the one lock off of Deer Island 50 to 100 times a year, and I can't imagine sitting there in the lock waiting for it to happen. But it's a really instructive example. It's elegant in its simplicity. I have yet to talk to Tony DeMambro. He's not here, is he, by any chance? It's wonderfully elegant. I think there are some really big questions about it. Number one, where does the water from the Mystic River and the Charles River go, and how do they drain out of there? And is the judge still here? We spent $6 billion cleaning up Boston Harbor. What impact will this kind of structure have on the water quality of Boston Harbor and the marine life that's coming back? What about the major shipping traffic that goes through Boston Harbor on a daily basis? All the recreational development, which is creating a huge industry now here in Boston. So there are lots of big questions that you have to look at when you address a real more comprehensive solution like this one in particular. Never mind the cost and financing. Our big dig started at, I even forget, $6 billion and went to 14. And then I lie awake at night thinking about these kind of things. The main, I wish I had a pointer, I don't, but where it goes from the top channel between Deer Island and Long Island, we just decided to spend $308 million to make that channel 20% deeper, from 40 feet to 50 feet, to handle the new ships coming through the Panama Canal. I don't know the physics. I don't think that changes. I think water rises to its own level no matter what, but it certainly makes putting in a barrier 20% at least more expensive because it's 20% more deeper. And then look just to the south of that, the Long Island Bridge that just got condemned and we're going to spend $90 million to rebuild. That's where those locks, that red line on the bottom are. So the good news is we have a lot of time to look at these kinds of comprehensive solutions. I think these are needed when you get into a scenario 1 or 2 feet of sea level rise over the next half century. There's a lot of things you can do with individual buildings and individual properties to make them resilient. But when you're talking about 3 to 6 feet, and again, we bounded ourselves at 2,100, what's going to happen after that? Then I think you have to start thinking about more comprehensive solutions. In the last several months, we've seen turn the back bay into a system of canals. At the charrette at ABX last week, somebody came up with a good idea. We have a wonderful 40 miles harbor walk around Boston Harbor. What if we were simply to build a 3 to 6 foot high seawall on the water side of that harbor walk? Could we plug all the remaining gaps? The other big question on a solution like this one, well, if we stop the water going into Boston Harbor, what about Quincy to the south and Revere to the north? And does it just come around Logan Airport into the back door of the city? So I don't want to disparage this idea in any way, because I think it served a really useful purpose, and I think we should look at it quite carefully. But I would imagine there are 20 more solutions that at some point, and we don't need to deploy anything, we have a lot of time, but at some point it would be interesting in the not too distant future to get the brains of our academic community here together and look at these in a comprehensive way and begin to figure out what might be possible if we need it. And that ultimately might get back to, well, there might not be things that we do short term if we knew we could do something like that long term. So, make sense? We just covered this topic pretty clearly, so I won't go into this slide, but how can we make Boston not always just talking about are we going to retreat or what's going to happen to our property or where are people going to go, but how can we make this city a real model of resiliency financing in the United States? How can we say to ourselves, we want to be the #1 city with the best waterfront that's the most resilient and most protected in the United States, because it's a major contribution to our tax base in the city. So whether it's insurance or financing or the bond structure or whatever it might be, I think this is another area where the universities, whether it's business schools or economics departments, could work with the city and the state and others and really begin to tackle this from a more positive view of how could we raise the capital to do what we need to do in a really big and powerful way going forward. How am I doing? All right, I'll try to wrap up. I just want to summarize a project that's been talked about in the Green Ribbon Commission that would be a collaboration between the academic and NGO community here and the city of Boston. And there's a memo that describes this, but I'll just summarize it with these 5 bullets. And this goes sort of from minimal to really increasing and maximal amount of commitments. Simply knowledge exchange, meetings like this, we should do as often as we can. We should always be upping the game to get to sort of the next important issue that needs to be discussed. Can help a lot on understanding the science and the economics of these problems. We could begin to integrate some of the challenges the city faces in the course content, in our urban design, our planning, or our economics courses here at many of the universities throughout the city, and provide some real-world examples of the challenges that a big city like Boston faces, and get some good ideas back. Integrate city content also into course materials, create city internships for students to really foster more engagement between the universities and the city. The city could commission research, and finally we could envision a really robust and comprehensive university-city research consortium that could help the city and the state address some of these big challenges ahead. So let me just finish. The challenge of working collaboratively with universities and cities is not going to be that easy. There are big differences in what I would call sort of the lifestyles in what makes an academic community quite different from a city agency. First of all, we're talking about applied research to tackle a lot of these problems versus basic research. And how do we match that up between what one does in a university and what one does in a public agency? We've got to find university projects that support professional and career objectives of academics in a place like BU. And then faculties themselves and the universities in evaluating faculty must balance teaching versus research versus community service. So how do we get to a point where we give greater weight perhaps to community service than we have in the past, particularly to take on a set of issues like we're talking about today? And I would imagine also the planning and the timescales differ for making decisions about what to take on and what not to take on. I've never worked in academia, but I've spent a lot of time raising money with the National Science Foundations and others. And I know you think many, many years ahead, and the grant applications take many years and many trials and many rejections before you finally get your funding. And it's a pretty long time cycle. And hopefully you're going to get funded for multiple years. Cities are usually thinking within the one term of a mayor. Sometimes it's within the first 100 days. And if you're lucky, like our good friend Tom Menino, it's 20 years. But I think the time scale is probably a bit shorter in general. And one of the big questions that I always run into on this issue is, what is going to, and Tom Menino was really remarkable in this way, there was no benefit to him in his political career if 30 years from now it turns out that Boston was well protected because of things he did now? Just think about that. Most politicians are not going to do things that are not going to get them elected at the next term. So we've really got to think about how to challenge, how to provide incentives, how to reward politicians who act on this issue, where the benefits, if they do it right, are going to come to the advantage of their successor 10, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. Big challenge. And then if you hear from Brian and others who have had experience with these floods and so on, they got to make decisions tomorrow. And I talk with a lot of developers on the waterfront in Boston. One of the other big challenges on this issue is they're usually designing their buildings and attracting investment for their buildings in a way that they can tell those investors, if I sell this building 10 years from now, I can give you a return of 12%. So they're very focused on a short-term 10-year period. How do we get them invested in these longer-term issues as well? You know, who will be the last guy or the last woman standing that owns that property after it's been flipped 11 times and the big storm finally comes? Big question. I drifted a little bit from the point of this slide, but bringing all these timescales into agreement is, I think, a big challenge, but I think it's doable. And then finally, I had to end on this slide. I was walking along the waterfront at Fan Pier yesterday and thinking about this conference, and you're going to die when you see this slide. It's on a big billboard on the end of Fan Pier, owned by my good friend Joe Fallon. Compelling location. Thank you very much.